17-year career at Human Rights Watch, which is probably the premier human rights organization on the planet. While at Human Rights Watch, he worked on a number of pressing issues around the globe, including here in the United States. Human Rights Watch's U.S. program is actually its biggest, and it takes on issues such as immigration, criminal justice reform, and issues around national security and the war on terror. Reed, in fact, himself wrote 4 reports dealing with issues of detention of combatants during the Bush administration year. You must feel somewhat like you're in that film Groundhog Day. Something we're having to like revive all of those legal analyses of the legality of indefinite detention, etc. So let's hope that doesn't go in that direction. In addition to Human Rights Watch, he's also worked with the International Commission of Jurists in Geneva, with the International Human Rights Law Group, with the Bureau des Avocats in Haiti, and a number of other human rights organizations around the world. His career has been characterized by consistently working in a collaborative way with human rights activists on the ground in the countries in which he works, and has often worked to defend human rights activists and help them get to situations of safety when they're working in deeply insecure situations. Another consistent theme of his work has been an intolerance for impunity, and he's worked very hard on a number of high-profile cases, even involving heads of state and former heads of state, in efforts to bring accountability. So the Pinochet case in the United Kingdom, in Chile, and in Spain, the Baby Doc Duvalier case in Haiti, and the case he's going to speak about tonight involving Hissène Habré, the former dictator of Chad, who was prosecuted in a really unique hybrid institution in Senegal. He won't remember this, but I first met Reed when I was a law student way back when. He'd come to give a talk about his human rights work. And I remember leaving that event and thinking to myself that I wanted to be just like Reed when I grew up. I'm not quite there, but I'm doing okay. I'm in the running. But I'm really, really pleased to be able to introduce him to so many students here. And I really hope that he inspires in you the same aspirations that he inspired in me. So with that, please welcome Reed Brody. 28 years ago.
Thank you very much, Beth. I'm glad I'm speaking before Harold Coe because A, I don't have to rebut what he says, and B, he's brilliant. And I may be dogged, but I may not be brilliant. This is the Handel Lecture on International Justice. Rather than to talk about the whole field of international justice, I really wanted to talk about this case. I think international justice over the last few years has become really contested terrain. We see a kind of a tug of war between the African Union and the International Criminal Court that precipitated the withdrawal of a number of African countries. We see a affirmation of double standards in international justice. Beth talked about the cases I worked on here in the United States. We believe, Human Rights Watch believes, I believe, that George Bush, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, George Tenet have a case to answer for torture, for waterboarding, and obviously that the International Criminal Court doesn't have a reach over crimes of the powerful, whether it be the United States, whether it be Russian crimes in Chechnya, whether it be North Korean crimes, people who are either veto-wielding members of the Security Council, or who are protected by the veto-wielding members of the Security Council. I want to talk about a very different model of international justice. A model that, when Beth was talking about the Pinochet case, the case of Baby Doc Duvalier, case of Rios Montt in former dictator of Guatemala, cases in which victims have organized to demand and to achieve justice. Cases like this case, and I'll run through the case. I'm very aware that most people generally have not heard of Hissène Habré, don't really know much about the history of Chad, so this is going to be very descriptive as we go along, but I'll try to go through it quickly, and then we can talk about some of the lessons for international justice. So Hissène Habré, does this work? Yeah. So Hissène Habré was the dictator of Chad in the 1980s. He was brought to power by Ronald Reagan. The first covert operation of the Reagan era, before the Contras, before Jonas Savimbi. He was brought to power as a bulwark against Muammar Gaddafi. You can see that Chad, Libyan troops were actually occupying Chad when Ronald Reagan came into office. And under President Reagan, the United States identified Chad as the soft underbelly of Gaddafi's power. And in the words of Alexander Haig, wanted to bloody Gaddafi's nose, and so helped Hissène Habré come to power. And the United States and France supported Hissène Habré throughout his rule. He was finally overthrown in 1990 by the man who 26 years later is still president of Chad, Idriss Déby. A truth commission found that he estimated that some 40,000 people were killed, and that torture was systematic. This is one of the signature, probably, torture method was called the abartachar, in which people's limbs were bound until it caused paralysis. Waterboarding, an earlier version of waterboarding. On the way out of the country, he basically emptied out, this is checks that was found, basically made out to Habré, in which he basically emptied out the country's treasury, and he brought that with him to Senegal. Mass graves were uncovered. His signature prison was called La Piscine, which was actually a swimming pool under the French colonizers that he had put a roof on, and the cells were built underground into what used to be a swimming pool. Habré fled to Senegal. I think I actually been using the latest version of this PowerPoint. Anyway, he fled in 1990 and basically lived in impunity in Senegal until for 10 years. Now, the case really began in the mind, some people, Carrie, you probably know him, right? In the mind of this man, Suleiman Geng, who, a deeply religious civil servant, who was put in jail and falsely accused. And as people were dying around him, Suleiman took an oath before God that if he ever got out of jail, he was going to fight for justice. And so when Habré was overthrown and the prison doors opened, Suleiman began to contact other survivors, and you see him here with these files that he put together, 792 files, individual files of different victims. But it became very clear that the new government of Idriss Déby was not very interested in justice. The Truth Commission's report was buried, and really nothing happened for 10 years until in 1998, the former dictator of Chile, Augusto Pinochet, was arrested in London. And when he appealed his arrest to the House of Lords, the House of Lords ruled, and Human Rights Watch and Amnesty were admitted as parties in that case, and I spent myself several months in England working on this case. Ultimately, the House of Lords ruled that despite Pinochet's status as a former head of state, he could be arrested and extradited anywhere in the world. And that really opened up, that was a moment of effervescence in the human rights community, and it opened up the possibilities. And who was mentioning Delphine to me? a woman from Chad, Delphine Giraï, who is the head of the Chadian Association for Human Rights, came to me at Human Rights Watch and basically said, we want to do that. And for the last 17 years, that's what we've been doing. Whoops. Uh-oh. Okay. This is a. So in 2000, we helped the victims file the first case against Habré in his exile in Senegal. And there you see, second to the left, you see a much younger, 17 years younger version of me. In the middle, you see Suleiman Gengang. Delphine is in the picture with a colored dress. And so the victims went from Chad to Senegal, filed the case. Habré was actually arrested. He was indicted for crimes against humanity and torture. And it was front page news in Africa and around the world. It looked like, you know, the Pinochet precedent was going to be applied immediately in Africa. Then, unfortunately, politics got in the way. A new president of Senegal came in. The case was dismissed after political interference. The case could have ended there. In the meantime, we continued to investigate. In 2001, I had the great fortune of stumbling onto the regime documents, basically the files of Hissène Habré's political police, tens of thousands of documents that really provided a roadmap to how the repression was carried out. And actually, there are several people in the room who've worked on those documents. Carrie, I'm sorry to keep mentioning, but Carrie was an intern and helped us code those documents. There are two friends here from the Human Rights Data Analysis Group who helped us develop a program. These are some of the documents, and these were lists of daily lists of detainees, evidence of agents being trained in the United States. This is the result of HRDAG's work. 1,208 individuals who were killed just in those documents alone, over 12,000 unique victims. We were able, through those documents, also to develop a number of leads. So, for instance, we found that there were Senegalese who had died in Hissène Habré's prisons. And of course, we were prosecuting the case in Senegal. And after a long search, we were actually able to find the Senegalese survivor of those jails, who became a major element of our campaign in Senegal. Because what we decided to do, what we realized that we needed to do, if we were going to create the political conditions to have Habré prosecuted, was to tell the victim's story. And that has really been, I think, the centerpiece of what we have done. This is a New York Times profile on Suleiman Gengang, who I've mentioned before. Obviously, in Anglophone, there's been much less in America, but a huge amount in France and in Africa that really focused on the stories of the individual victims. The other thing we did was we spent time training the victims to be their own advocates, both to tell their story, but also the background of the case, what the issues were, basically advocacy 101. We actually invested in English training to teach some of them who spoke some English to speak English better, because obviously although both Senegal and Chad are French-speaking countries, we want them to speak English. President Wade of Senegal then ordered Hissène Habré, even though he had, through political interference, prevented the case from going forward, he then asked Hissène Habré to leave the country. And we knew from our sources that Habré was going to go probably to Saudi Arabia, which is where Idi Amin already was, and we knew that we would never catch up to him at that point. And so we brought a case before the UN Committee Against Torture, Geng versus Senegal, and the UN Committee Against Torture issued the equivalent of an injunction to Senegal, asking them not to let Hissène Habré leave the country. Because our plan B was that we had filed a case in Belgium, which had a long-arm jurisdictional law. So Habré, once again, the dictator is in Senegal. The case was thrown out in Senegal. We filed a case in Belgium to try to get Habré's extradition. A Belgian judge, prosecutor, carry out a mission. They spend several years investigating the case. As some of you know, the Belgian law on universal jurisdiction was so wide and so generous that basically everybody was filing cases in Belgium. There were cases in Belgium against, I think it was, somebody said 35 political leaders of 35 different countries. And it became impossible for Belgium. A case was filed against Ariel Sharon in Belgium for the Chabra and Shatila massacre. Israel broke relations with Belgium. I don't know if they broke relations, but they recalled their ambassador. It became very difficult. The Congo, countries where Belgium has had traditional influence. I mean, the foreign minister said to me, we can't do diplomacy. I can't talk to a president. He's being sued in my capital. And the law became a victim of its own generosity. And then when a case was brought against George Bush father, for the first Iraq War, the law started to really unravel. What we did is that we brought the victims to Belgium. We brought Suleiman to Belgium and others. And Suleiman, in a way, and this is really, as a human rights activist, one of the things that you learn is that victims can do things, people who are affected can do things that you cannot do. And Suleiman met with the foreign minister, we met with the justice minister, we met with the law commission, and Suleiman looks them in the eye and says, he tells his story of how he was in jail and how he was always thinking about justice. And he came out and filed the case in Senegal, and Senegal said no. And then he filed the case in Belgium, and Belgium said yes. And Belgium sent a judge. And people came out of the woodwork to meet the Belgian judge and to give their testimony. And then they came to Belgium to watch a trial of Rwandan genocidaires in Belgium. They went back to Chad and said, guys, we made the right choice. Belgium has a good legal system. We're in good hands. And now you're telling us that because of George Bush, we can't have justice? No, Mr. Geng, no. We'll figure out a way to save your case. And so the law was repealed, and this case and a couple of other cases were saved. After 4 years, Belgium requested Habré's extradition from Senegal in 1985. Actually, it's 2005. Again, we had one of our key ally, one of our key advocates in Senegal was the Senegalese guy, Abdourahmane Gueye. You can't get more typical Senegalese than this guy. I mean, he was a merchant in Chad, and he and his friend were arrested, and his friend died. His friend died in prison. They arrested him to take his gold that he was carrying, but they threw him in jail. His friend died. The Senegalese government actually got him out, and he became the person who spoke in Wolof, the language of Senegal, to say, you know what, these guys from Chad and these white guys, what they're saying is true. Believe it. And he became a human rights activist. Senegal refused extradition. They asked the African Union what should be done. Long and complicated story, but the African Union, we were able actually to turn the African Union into an ally. So Suleiman and Clement and the other victims went to the African Union. They said, look, this is an act, you have to give us justice. And the African Union, which we were very afraid, they were going to ask, Omar el-Bashir and Robert Mugabe what should be done with Hissène Habré. But the African Union, which is involved in this tug of war with the ICC, understood the political benefit of being able to prosecute African crimes in Africa. So and the legal director, so they created a committee to provide a legal response. In the meantime, the Committee Against Torture gave a final ruling in the Guinguian case that Senegal had violated international law. And the African Union, hearing their legal committee, said, okay, Senegal has an obligation, the same obligation in the Pinochet case, extradite or prosecute. We don't want an African leader being prosecuted in Europe. Senegal, you have to prosecute him. Senegal said, okay. They changed their laws. We filed a new complaint. Nothing happened. Again, years of bringing the victims around Africa, particularly to Senegal, meeting with politicians in Senegal, meeting with trade union activists, meeting with NGOs, talking to the press, speaking out. Finally, Senegal said, we're not doing this. This is too costly. Belgium, where we had created political support across Belgium, from the Flemish and from the Wallons and from the Conservatives and from the Liberals. We actually had a committee in Belgium of parliamentarians and everyone supporting the Habré case. And Belgium did really the unthinkable, which is that they took Senegal to the International Court of Justice to request that Senegal live up to its international obligations to either prosecute or extradite Hissène Habré. And again, we actually had, it's hard to imagine that this was something that was on the front page of Belgian newspapers, but this became we made sure that the government felt supported in doing this, that it got political approval across the political spectrum and from the newspapers. We also had Belgian plaintiffs, Chadian people of Chadian origin who were Belgians, who again took the lead. People from Liège and Brussels who were from Belgium, who were from Chad, but had a certain connection to Belgium. And on July 20th, 2012, my birthday, the ICJ ruled that Senegal had to prosecute Hissène Habré without further delay, or proceed to his execution. So after 13 years, everything changed with two things. First, that decision, and secondly, the man who had really stood in our way, the president of Senegal, was defeated. And so you had these, and Macky Sall was one of the many politicians who we had met with. So 3 years earlier, we had sat in a room with Macky Sall, with Abdourahmane Gueye, explained to him in Wolof that what these guys are saying is true, with leading activists from Senegal, Alioune Tine, saying how hard. And Macky Sall told us 3 years before that if he became president, he would prosecute Hissène Habré. We didn't believe him, because that's what everybody says. But he actually stood by his word. And very shortly after his election, his Minister of Justice actually I've met, I think, 12 or 13 Senegalese ministers of justice. And usually they avoid us. And here was a Minister of Justice calling me up and saying, how do we get this done? And from then on, things became actually much easier. A court was set up, as Beth mentioned, a special court in Senegal. This is the Minister of Justice, the woman who really made everything change. A court was set up, a hybrid court, between Senegal and the African Union, to prosecute the person or persons most responsible for crimes, international crimes during Habré's rule. A budget of $9.7 million. Sounds to the average person like a lot. The Sierra Leone court, the court that tried Charles Taylor and others, cost $300 million. And that's the least expensive of the international tribunals. The courts in The Hague and Arusha cost $1 billion. This was $10 million. The court was established in 2013. Habré was indicted. Now, we clearly, internationally, really, it was our message, it was our narrative. Habré in Senegal, which is where he invested all that money, had a lot of support. He had paid off newspapers, he paid off politicians, he paid off religious leaders, and he had a considerable amount of support. And so again, we kept bringing the victims. Habré's wife, a couple of days after Habré was arrested, Habré's wife wrote a letter to the president of Senegal, a public letter saying, oh, you know, my husband's been arrested, it's horrible, Ramadan is beginning, you have no idea what it's like to pass Ramadan without my husband. Our daughter came home with her school notes, her school marks, this is my father. The very next day, the vice president of the Victims Association says, well, you know something, my husband has been gone for 26 Ramadans. You know where your husband is. He's being treated according to the rule of law. My husband was disappeared. She shut up. And we kind of, that was, each time that Habré tried to play the victim, each time he tried to make it into a north-south confrontation, there were victims who said, well, wait a second, I'm not an imperialist, I'm not a colonialist. So the investigating judges for the tribunal, conducted 4 missions to Chad. They interviewed thousands of people. Habré was committed, I'm going to go fast. Habré was committed for trial. Now, all of this is going on in Senegal. Back in Chad, we had the victims filed cases in Chad against the people who had worked with Habré, who were still in Chad. And that was much, much more dangerous, actually. It was their threats and things that forced Suleiman into exile. They tried to assassinate the lawyer, Jacqueline Mudena, whose picture you've seen and we'll see again. But when we were banking on things in Senegal being a trigger for things in Chad. And that's what happened. When Habré was arrested in Senegal, the Chadian government was up, and they started arresting all the people who worked with Habré. And put them on trial back in Chad. This is the plaintiffs. I sent you the latest version. Anyway, these are some of the plaintiffs. These are the lawyers in the case that happened in Chad. And in March 2015, a very dramatic trial in Jamena, actually in many ways, much more dramatic than the trial of Hissène Habré, because it played out in front of the Chadian people to packed audiences each day. Very dramatic testimony. 21 of the members of Habré's political police were prosecuted, and 27 were prosecuted, 25 were prosecuted, 21 were convicted, and some of them are serving up to life in jail. The court also ordered the Chadian government to pay and the defendants to pay $125 million to the victims, which they haven't seen yet. This is that's some of the people Jacqueline. These are some of the Chadian. Now, the Chadian government has a very multi-layered relationship to the case that we are bringing, and it's kind of important politically to understand that the man who now runs Chad for the last 26 years overthrew Habré But he had been Habré's military chief. And he was very implicated in at least one of the, or we believe he was implicated in at least one of the episodes, one of the worst episodes of violence. He also brought in a lot of people from Habré's government, the people who were on trial. But this case could not have gone forward had the Chadian government not, when push came to shove, given its approval. So they waived Hissène Habré's immunity of jurisdiction after an ICJ, a different case that the ICJ had raised the possibility that heads of state would have immunity. They invited the judges to come. They became the #1 donor to the court. What happened, though, was because the special court had jurisdiction to try the person or persons most responsible, that raised the possibility that Idriss Déby himself might be subject to the court's jurisdiction. And then the Chadian government started backing away from the court and started, but they did allow the trial to be televised in Chad. The trial of Hissène Habré finally began on July 20th, which is the first day, Habré's position was that he did not recognize the tribunal. And so the first day he actually created an outburst and started screaming. And he started creating a ruckus, and he was actually taken out of court. Here you see some of it was actually often front page news in Senegal.
Tortures the court.
So she dan de la farce. Well, there's a French saying dan de la farce, which means like you're the one you're the turkey who the joke is being played on. Dan is a turkey, and this is dan de la force instead of de la farce. Anyway, they have headlines. They do good headlines there. So Habré's line is "Abat l'impérialisme," you know. So the next day, Habré's lawyers refused to appear because they didn't recognize the court. We talked about this in Beth's class this morning. The court then appointed lawyers to represent Habré, which was a somewhat controversial decision. Habré's position and Habré's real lawyer's position was, look, we don't want lawyers. We don't believe, don't give us lawyers to make this look like it's a real trial. This is a political thing. It's being set up by Idriss Déby, being run by Human Rights Watch. We don't recognize this, and you're just giving us lawyers to make it look like this is a fair trial. The court-appointed lawyers, I think, were in a very, very difficult position, clearly. They didn't have communication with their client officially, although as time went along, we noticed that there was. We had 15 years to prepare the case. They had 45 days. But this was his choice. This was Habré's choice. He basically spent the entire time silent, day in and day out, pretending almost like he wasn't there. Except at the end of the day, at the end of each session, he would walk and he would go like this, and his family, which was in the court, would applaud for him. The victims, of course, this was a poster that was This was a poster that was plastered all over, that we plastered all over Dakar. You were our dictator. You could do what you want with us, and now you're not even like there when we tell our story. This is his chosen lawyer. I have to hurry up. So the trial was conducted under French rules, so civil parties. This is Jacqueline Moudena, one of the bravest women who I know, who was the lawyer for the victims who survived an assassination attempt. Again, each day at the trial, it was the victims telling their story, coming out, talking to the press. The trial, it was a well-run trial. I wouldn't say it was a high-quality trial, but it was preceded first expert witnesses testifying, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch statistician Patrick Ball, document expert who showed, on the documents that we had found that this was Habré's handwriting. Obviously, the documents were the backbone of this case. An insider from the political police, forensic experts who dug up mass graves. They went through the different episodes of the repression, journalist who was killed, a man who was forced when he was in prison to dig the graves of other prisoners. One of the great moments of my life was when Suleiman got to testify, and he brought with him the utensils that he had fashioned in prison, and the judges looked at him like, "What? 25 years?" No, I've been waiting for this day for 25 years. It was probably the biggest news of the trial, which was something that we had something we talk about later, that only really came to us as the trial was really going to happen, was that these women had been sent to be sexual slaves for the army. These are people that we interviewed that we had women interviewed 15 years ago and never talked about this. And then as the trial was approaching, the women started to tell us these stories. Women who were raped in prison, and a woman who was raped 4 times by Hissène Habré. Habré's official website, he didn't participate, but he had a website that would respond to everything. Calls them nymphomaniacs and prostitutes. Balthazar Garçon was there, the Senegalese victim testifying. These are some of the exhibits that the plaintiffs put in to show how Habré was in charge of everything. The trial was broadcast on Chadian TV. It was posted online. There were outreach meetings in Chad. On May 30th of last year, Habré was convicted, sentenced to life imprisonment. He was convicted of the rape of that woman, Khadija Hassan. One of the things that are still being worked out is the question of victim compensation. Habré was basically asked to pay about $90 million. We're now trying to find that money. The most important, for me, as I suggested, the most important takeaway of this trial was how this was a trial that was achieved and showcased the work of the victims. This is, some of you will know me, wrote Ariadza, who wrote this about 10 years ago and talked about the difference between the Hague-based cases and cases in which transnational cases which were brought by the victims and which rely on the agency of the victims. The idea that, people in Chad made this happen. I was saying to somebody today, people in Chad watched this case on TV and saw their former dictator being tried, not because the current dictator particularly wanted him to be tried, but because people like Suleiman and Jacqueline had fought for him to be tried. And Chad is still an authoritarian country 26 years later. It's still being supported by the West for the same reasons that Hissène Habré was being supported. But a space has opened, and other people, Jacqueline travels around the continent to talk about, what happened. Suleiman was actually profiled again in the New York, there was a Saturday profile in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago. People are now, I'm getting calls from people from the Gambia, from people from Burundi. This is accessible, You can't be, people sitting in this room, we can't be, well, you can be perhaps, but, we can't be state officials sitting on the Security Council. We can't be the prosecutor of the ICC, but you can be Reed Brody. You can be, if you're a survivor, you can be Suleiman Gang. These are things that are actually accessible for people to do. And I think we were able to cut through kind of the politics of it by putting these stories out in front. So, thank you very much.